Shabbat Shalom. It's been a very full week. It feels like it's been a long week. It's been a week, I guess, I don't know, like every week where we've had accomplishments and we've seen some failures, we've had celebrated new life and we've mourned loss. Again, I know every week is like that, full of highs and lows and calm moments and hectic moments, but for some reason this week it's really felt especially full. I think I'm actually not used to the time change yet. And something about like the short days just makes everything feel very compressed. This week we joined Rabbi Ain and her family mourning the loss of her grandmother, Sybil Heyerman, Zichrona Livracha. And as Rabbi Ain shared with us, reflecting on Sybil's life gave her an opportunity to appreciate the remarkable journey that she had in her life, lasting just under 98 years. And that gave me an opportunity to reflect on my own grandmother's life. My grandmother passed a few years ago, and my grandmother Sadie was the only member of my family who was still alive when I was born, who had been born in Europe. She was born in Hungary in 1917. And she emigrated to Chicago as a teenager before the war, so she's not a survivor in a traditional sense that we use that word, but still her life story bore the scars of the persecution of Jews in Europe. She had 9 brothers and sisters. She was one of 10, and they were born in 4 or 5 different countries as her family moved across Europe and eventually sought safety in this country, in the United States. And when my grandmother died, I realized that my link to that journey from Europe to America that my family took and that many of our families took was lost. That link was broken. It made me think of, some of you may be familiar with Tony Kushner's play Angels in America, but that opens with a monologue, a eulogy given at a similar funeral. And Tony Kushner calls that the Great Voyage. And the rabbi in that funeral, who's played by Meryl Streep in the HBO movie, the rabbi says, every day of your lives, the miles of that voyage between that place and this one, you cross. Every day we live those miles of that journey. In you, that journey is. And Tony Kushner calls it the great journey, or the great voyage, and says that there are no great voyages like that anymore in our people's story. And I'm not so sure that's true. Certainly in humanity there are great voyages taken like that, sometimes taken willingly, sometimes taken unwillingly, sometimes to find opportunity, sometimes to escape harm, and sometimes a little bit of both. This week I heard about 3 other remarkable journeys, not even including the one in our Torah portion, that I want to share with you. Some of us were here together on Wednesday night, or Tuesday night, for our multi-faith Kristallnacht observance. And we heard from Marty Bronstein, who wrote a book called Two Among the Righteous Few, that talks about his journey back to Holland, not back to Holland, to Holland, to discover more about the lives of the couple that hid his wife's family and many other Jewish families during the war in a small town in the Netherlands. So he took that journey, and then he wrote a book about that journey and shared what he discovered about that family, shares it with all of us. I actually haven't read the book yet. I'm looking forward to reading the book, but not having read it doesn't stop me from recommending that you buy the book and read the book. Another journey I heard about this week was a journey that the chancellor of the Jewish Theological Seminary took, where I study. Chancellor Arnie Eisen took a trip to the border with Hayes and Trua and many other Jewish clergy members to learn more and to see firsthand, to the extent that they could, the conditions of people's lives there on the border. And he came back and he shared with us in very personal terms. He shared with the whole JTS community how meaningful it was to him and how important it was to him, not just to take that journey and to see with his own eyes something that many of us watch on the news or read about in the newspaper, but then to come back and tell us about it. To him, it was integral to taking the journey to share about it. And he spoke about something very personal, which he shared publicly, and which maybe some of you know. This trip that he took to the border came just about 1 year after the massacre in the Tree of Life synagogue. And one of the victims of that event was Chancellor Eisen's former roommate. So he had a very personal connection to that tragedy. And that individual was very committed in his life to Jewish acts of social justice. And in fact, we know that one of the reasons that those synagogue building and that one of those communities inside that synagogue building was targeted was because that was a community that had partnered with Hias and that had made rights for immigrants and refugees a core part of their identity. So for Chancellor Eisen, going to the border, he said he was representing his former roommate, his dear friend whose life had been lost, and carrying on the justice work that had been so important to him. And again, not just going, but telling about it, telling us about it. And then the third journey that I heard about this week was I heard Ariel Berger, the author of Witness, by a book about his experience being Elie Wiesel's student and colleague. I heard him speak at a synagogue out where I live in Long Island. And this is a plug, not a spoiler, because this same exact program is coming to Sutton Place Synagogue in a few months. So I encourage you to go to that, but I've already seen it. But Ariel Berger wrote this book about 25 years of his association with Elie Wiesel, starting as his student and then becoming his teaching assistant and then his doctoral student and really becoming very close with him over time. So Ariel Berger's journey was a different kind of journey. It was journey through memory. He went through all of his journals and letters and recollections of having worked with this incredible figure for many, many years and wrote a book about the lessons that he learned from him. And of course, the title of the book is Witness. That's a really important theme in Elie Wiesel's life and a really important message that Ariel Berger hopes to teach to us. He teaches us that witnessing something implicates you in the story of what you witness. Witnessing is not a passive act. It's a call to action. It's an invitation. At the end of the program with Ariel Berger, there was this really special moment during the Q&A. Maybe I'll recreate it when we have the Sutton Place Synagogue, where somebody said, "You've told us why you found Elie Wiesel so meaningful and inspiring and such an important teacher. What do you think he saw in you? Why did he choose you to be his teaching assistant?" and so on. And Ariel Berger was kind of, I think, stunned by the question. It took him a while to answer. And he ultimately said he didn't know. He couldn't know what it was that Elie Wiesel saw in him to really choose him and take him under his wing. And that's that not knowing why you're chosen, I think there's something really important about that. Sometimes you know why you've been chosen for a particular journey or why you've chosen to undertake something. Sometimes we have no idea. Sometimes circumstances just arise in our lives, and all of a sudden we're on a path and we have to go, and we're going to figure it out as we go along. And that's really how I think of the beginning of Avram's story in our parsha this week. Avram is chosen out of nowhere. God has been basically silent for 10 generations since the incident of the building of the Tower of Babel and the destruction of the Tower of Babel. We haven't really heard much from God. And now, 10 generations later, this parsha opens with God's call to Abraham, Lech, Lecha, pick up and go from your land, from your birthplace, and from your father's house, and go to the land that I will show you. Out of nowhere. Unlike Noah, we don't already know that Avram is righteous in his generation. We have almost no information about Avram's childhood. That's why there's so many great midrashic stories, like the smashing of the idols that some of us may be familiar with. None of that is in Torah. All of that is imagined to help fill in the gaps, because we can't understand why this incredibly important person in our story, in our tradition, really the beginning of our story, has no background, no backstory. And that phrase, Lech lecha me'artzecha u'mimoladecha u'miveit avicha, there's some confusing things about that phrase, about that command. First of all, let's start with Lech lecha. Okay, maybe you've already learned that I have like a thing about language and grammar, and if you come to my Shakespeare class later today, you'll get another taste of that. But Lech lecha is an unusual phrase in Hebrew. So the first word, Lech, is the imperative, the command form of the verb lalechet, to go or to walk. Okay, so that one we understand. Lech, go. But what's that second word doing there, lecha? So this is like a preposition. It means something like to you, or for you, or maybe with you, or by yourself. It's a little bit confusing, and we almost never see that preposition with the verb lalechet. It's very unusual. In fact, Lech lecha in that construction only appears one other time in Torah. Anybody know when? Only one other time. It happens right before the Akedah, right before the binding of Isaac, right before, also with Abraham. A few chapters later, God says, Lech lecha eretz Moriah, go to that land of Moriah, and there you will take your son, and so on, and we may know the rest of that story. So only 2 times do we hear Lech lecha. So there's something strange going on here. Also, the rest of the statement, from your land, from your birthplace, and from your father's house, there's a lot of confusing things about that statement too. First of all, they've already left Ur Kasdim. They've already left the place where Avram was born. They're in Haran. So they've already left their land. They've already left Abraham's birthplace. And then the last one, go from your father's house. Okay, Abraham was 75 years old. I know maybe some parents imagine that their children will always want to live with them, and that's a nice idea. But he was 75. He wasn't even a boomerang child. He'd never boomered, let alone rang back. So it's time for him to go. It's time for him to leave his father's house. So what was the point of this Lech lecha statement? If they were already, oh, and by the way, to the land that I will show you, well, that's Canaan. They were actually already on their way to Canaan. So there's no mystery here. To the land I will show you, they know where they're going. And they get there. Then they leave, but that's another story. So the Mishnah tells us that God is going to test Abraham 10 times. That there's going to be 10 trials in Abraham's life to test his devotion. And that the Mishnah imagines, well, there's a couple of different versions, but that this is that first big test. This is that first real major test in Avram's life to go from his father's land. And that another one of those big tests, in some lists it's the last test, is the binding of Isaac, our other Lech lecha moment. But why is God testing Abraham? Well, again, we don't know anything about Abraham at this point. His name isn't even Abraham yet, as Rabbi Ain pointed out. It's still Avram. So these 2 acts, leaving your father's house and being told to potentially sacrifice your beloved son, these would be cutting ties with the generation that comes before you and the generation that comes after you. This puts you maybe by yourself, maybe on your own path. Another one of the tests is to expel Ishmael, another way of cutting off the generation that comes before you. So the nature of a test is to not demonstrate a quality that you already know you have, right? A test is to find the limit. It's not the floor, it's the ceiling. If you take a math test, you're not gonna see easy math questions that you already know the answer to. A good teacher will find the limit of your ability. They'll ask you harder and harder and harder questions until you find what that ceiling is of that ability. So we learn later that Abraham, is a paragon of chesed, of loving kindness, and of emunah, of faith. Now we don't know that yet, but we can imagine that these tests, being told to leave his father's land and also being told to sacrifice his son, will be tests of that chesed and that emunah. But God already knows this about Abraham. So why is he testing him? Well, maybe one of the reasons is so that Abraham can learn it for himself. And maybe that's one of the clues of that second Lecha, is that you're taking this journey not for God's sake, but you're taking this journey to learn something about yourself, to discover who you are. And that's why it's so important to notice what kind of journeyer is Abraham. Is he obedient all of the time? Does he never push back? Does he never challenge? No. Our tradition is full of stories where Abraham is not just a passive journeyer. He takes an active role. He challenges God. When God says that you will have children as plentiful as the sea in this parsha, Abraham challenges God by asking, how will I know? He says, how will I know when I've possessed the land? Later, in a few chapters from now, we have the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, when Abraham actually argues with God, actually intercedes and says, no, this is not the way things are supposed to go. Things are supposed to go a different way. And he tries to convince God to recant. So that, to me, is what Chancellor Eisen is doing, what Marty Brownstein, the author of Two Among the Righteous Few, is doing, and what Ariel Berger is doing. They are going on the journey, but they're not passive about it. They're engaging in what they see. They're witnessing, and to them that means telling us about what they witness. That's also what Elie Wiesel did with his life. That's why he chose to devote his life to writing, to teaching, and to speaking, so that he could be an active participant in the journey that he was on, and so that he could witness by teaching us something. When Avraham, not yet Abraham, and Sarai, not yet Sarah, set out from Haran, they take all of us with them. That's why the text points out, just a few lines later, that they left at Nefesh Asher Asu Haran, with all of the souls that they made in Haran. What does that mean that they made souls? Well, some commentators take a very simple approach. They say they took the household. They took the maid and the cook and the babysitter. Well, they didn't need a babysitter yet, but they took whoever was around. But Rashi says that Asu here means Shehich Nasan Tachat Kanafeh HaShechina, that they brought those people under the wings of the Shekhinah. In other words, that they converted people. Now, this is a little bit retrojection. They weren't really quite Jewish yet. I'm not sure what they were converting people from or to, but it's a beautiful thought that they, so early in their relationship with God, so early on that journey, before they had even really set out to do anything, they were telling people about it. They were saying, come on, we're going on a journey. Come with us. We're not going alone. They didn't keep it to themselves. And that's what makes their test personal. Those are the personal stakes, is because they shared it with their community and they brought people along. So what is testing us right now? What is testing us individually? And what is testing us as a community? What is testing the Jewish people? What is testing the American people? What is testing humankind? How will we know if we've passed that test? That's one of Avram's questions. How will I know when I've possessed the land? Each of us will answer those questions differently. The important part is that we do answer them, and not only to ourselves, quietly, but that we answer them in the way that we live our lives. And that's what it means to bear witness. That's what it means to be part of that great covenant that God made with Avram and with Sarai and with all of our other forebears. Elie Wiesel teaches, and Ariel Berger teaches us, that listening to a witness makes you a witness. When we hear the story of a witness, whether it's a witness of the Shoah or a witness of atrocities and abuse, either in our country or other countries, that implicates us. That makes us witnesses too, because now we not only get to, but we have to, we're called upon to share that story out. And I think that's what we do when we engage with our Torah. We listen to the story of our people. We're bearing witness to it. We are bearing witnesses to our own beginnings. And that's how the final thought I'll share with you about that Lech Lecha. That's how the commentator Kali Yakar understands it. That Lech Lecha means Lech la'atzmotecha. Go to your true self, your essence, your selfhood. That's what Avram was being asked to do. not take a geographic journey, but take maybe a spiritual journey, a journey into his soul, a journey into the true essence of who he was. Go find yourself. And Avram can't do that in his father's home. He can't do that in his birthplace. He has to physically remove himself from those familiar comforts in order to see something new. At 75 years old, he takes that journey. So for us, going to our atzmotenu, going to our true essence, might not entail upending our lives like that. It might just mean moving through the world we see and we inhabit a little bit differently, looking a little bit differently. What are we avoiding seeing right now? What are we closing our eyes to that we need to open our eyes to? So Elie Wiesel could have stayed silent after the Holocaust. And we know many survivors did, and we can't fault them for the decisions that they made. Trauma affects each of us differently. Wiesel himself made a vow not to write anything at all about his experience for 10 years after his liberation. For 10 years, he was silent, like the 10 generations of silence between Noach and Avram. And in that period of reflection and healing, after that period of reflection and healing, he wrote a magnum opus, hundreds and hundreds of pages in Yiddish, detailing everything he could remember of his account of the war and his survival and his liberation. He wrote it in Yiddish, hundreds and hundreds of pages, and he whittled that account down smaller and smaller and smaller to its essence. And what we were left with is his book, Night, his first act of bearing witness, the essence of his story. So Elie Wiesel knew that, at least for him, survival obligated him to share his story. Like Abraham, his legacy was realized in the effect that he had on those that came after him, like his student Ariel Berger, who now is our teacher. So it is incumbent on us to go to experience the journey, whatever that means to us, with our eyes open, to engage with the journey, to argue if we need to argue, to push back when we need to push back, and then to come back and to tell about it. Because once we've witnessed something, we are then implicated in that story. And once we become witnesses, we then are witnesses, and we have the opportunity and the obligation to share out what we've learned so that we can continue the legacy of change that these people have given us. Shabbat Shalom.